resume this hearing. I now welcome officials from Treasury and the Australian Taxation Office. Thank you for appearing before the committee today. I remind officials that the Senate has resolved that an officer of the Department of the Commonwealth or of a state or territory shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and shall be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to a minister. This resolution prohibits only questions asking for opinions on matters of policy and does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. Questions on notice are due on the 10th of January. For the Hansard record, could you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear? Who wants to start?
Chris Leggett, Principal Advisor, Law Design Office at the Treasury.
Patrick Boneham, Division Head of the Black Economy Division, Treasury.
Michael Hardy, Assistant Commissioner with the Australian Taxation Office.
Peter Holt, Assistant Commissioner, Australian Taxation Office.
Welcome to you all. Does one or both organisations wish to make any opening remarks?
We're happy to go straight to questions.
Happy to go straight to questions, thanks, Senator.
Okay then. I guess I'll kick off. In terms of the Black Economy Task Force, obviously we've got the report here. It was a pretty significant report with a lot of recommendations. Where are we at in terms of working our way through the Black Economy Task Force report, and where does this particular piece of legislation fit within the overall scope of those recommendations?
Thank you, Senator. I think it's important to note that the Black Economy report is a whole of government report. It's up about 80 recommendations were made within that report, covering things from tax evasion, and the Black Economy Task Force was very wanted to ensure that the black economy was not just seen as tax evasion, that it had a much broader impact on society. So they looked at issues such as welfare fraud, digital identity, employee entitlements. So that it was quite broad in relation. Legal gambling was another one as well. The government has, I think, moved on about 20 so far. It got announced in budget last year, so within about 16 months, 22 have been done. And they made a commitment to do around 56 of those recommendations. The government didn't agree to about 3 of them and noted a number of them as well. So there's been quite a significant progress done in relation to the Black Economy Task Force. In relation to this particular recommendation, it is just one part of that whole of government strategy. It targets a specific part of the black economy, and I think the witness from United Church said it's not a panacea for all the black economy activity. It is very selective and targeted. And that is the issues around pretty egregious tax evasion, but also money laundering, which is falling out the gap from the AUSTRAC processes. The issue with this one is the black economy was basically, and a lot of the recommendations from that came from evidence from which Michael Andrew and his secretariat found while going and speaking to the communities, business organisations and other public sector agencies. And what that found was that there was a growing frustration from businesses that other businesses were using cash discounts to cut them out. So it was a competition issue. So for Michael, it was a fairness issue. So it's fairness above tax evasion in his mind. So he didn't think it was fair that some businesses were putting money into their business and not being able to compete on the basis because some other business wasn't prepared to meet their obligations. So he didn't want a situation where a business had to actually compete by breaking the law. So he came up with the $10,000 one. He also heard stories about, and he passed these on to me, of a car dealership being offered $1.5 million in cash for 10 cars. The car dealer took it, but when they traced it back, it was found to be an organised gang. But the car dealer had no option to say yes or no to that. They took it. They probably thought it was suspect. However, there's no way in which they know that. So from Michael's point of view, he saw that as a gap in the existing legislation. So that's the purpose of this particular provision. He also, they also didn't, the task force didn't want to disrupt day-to-day transactions. That's the reason for the high level, so the 10,000 amount. And the 10,000 amount was also set as so it could be complement the AML CTF law as well.
So one of the potential issues that arise from this, and I'll make this up as an example. A coffee shop which does deal in a lot of cash goes regularly to a supplier and buys their beans over the course of a month or two. They rack up over 10,000, though no individual transaction is worth more than 4. They decided, for practicality's sake, because they do have a lot of cash on hand, to use cash. Will that get caught by this legislation?
Only if the specific transaction is $10,000 or more. So
but cumulatively it will be?
It's not a cumulative
Okay.
threshold.
Sorry, so that if they paid 5,000 and 5,000, it's not?
That would be okay.
So it's got to be a single transaction?
Single transaction above
Over
$10,000 or more.
So do we have any idea, both in terms of stocks and flows, how much cash is being used for illegal transactions? I mean, the figure of, I think, 3.3 billion is bandied round at times, but I think that's more than just cash. So do we have any idea of the scope of the issue that we're addressing here?
It's very hard because by its nature it's hidden. And once the cash is in the legitimate economy, it's very difficult to then distinguish what its source was. And I think that is one of the reasons why they wanted to target this amount in relation to people who are sort of money laundering their ill-gotten gains. The RBA did mention that I think they have an estimate of about 4 to 8% of cash on hand is used for shadow economy, black economy purposes. So at about 80%, you're looking somewhere around 6.5, up maximum about 6.5 billion.
Okay, and the 10,000, I think you probably covered this, but it's why was that number picked rather than 20 or 5?
One, it was to complement the AML, so the money laundering and counter-terrorism financing legislation. Michael thought there was a gap. The AML CTF is not economy-wide. It is mainly related to financial institutions, gambling, bullion dealers and remittance dealers. So it's not a comprehensive regime. So there are things which you can do outside of that regime to launder money. There has been calls to expand that regime to include real estate agents, lawyers, accountants. But at the moment, the legislation only applies to those which currently are affected by the law. So from that point of view, it sort of made sense to Michael and the task force to set it at $10,000, because that's where you would start to suspect more suspicious transactions starting to occur in the economy. The other thing, what I mentioned before, is they didn't want it set it at a lower level to affect day-to-day transactions. So they really wanted to target it. It's a targeted measure. It's not as low as it is in European Union countries. I think the lowest there is about 1,000 euros. But they have a different purpose than what this law is for. They were basically trying to target terrorism offences. And what they found is that terrorism offences are pretty low value. So hiring, purchasing guns, hiring vans, etc. So they have a much lower threshold than what we do.
So in terms of your consultation,
Yes.
have you talked to those businesses who still have, the potential at least to have, reasonable amounts of transactions in cash? I'm assuming that it would probably still be things like the restaurant trade, perhaps used car sales, the hospitality industry in general. Did you talk directly with those industry participants, and what feedback did you get from them?
So we mainly targeted what we saw as high value businesses, high value goods businesses. So the restaurant trade, it's highly unlikely they're probably doing a $10,000 sale. It's not out of the ordinary. It may not be.
I'm thinking more that they'd be dealing with suppliers,
Suppliers,
potentially with a lot of cash.
So we actually have an advisory board, and we have the head of the Restaurant and Caterers Association on that, and he hasn't made any comment about that. I haven't specifically asked him though. We've spoken to the Motor Traders Association. They generally think that a lot of their members actually don't deal in cash. There's concerns of taking large amounts of cash, in that you could have employee theft, you could have just general theft. You've got the cost of actually counting, moving it to a bank. So there are costs in relation to having large amounts of cash on your premises. We also spoke to the Jewellers Association. They, again, don't think a lot of their memberships actually accept cash in at such high values. And we've also spoken to Flight Centre, and they've raised some issues mainly around the start date, that they would need time to adjust to a cash limit.
Okay. How do exemptions work under the legislation? Are there any, and what, is there a process by which an industry could ask for an exemption?
So obviously exemptions would be a decision for government.
Okay.
And the government would need to consider that on a case-by-case basis.
So that's who's it a decision for? Is there provisions in the bill for
Yes, there's
exemptions?
provisions for exemptions within the bill.
I thought there was.
And they're currently done by law, rules, which will be set out by the
So that's
Treasurer.
a ministerial decision?
Ministerial discretion.
Okay. I'll go to Senator Patrick next, as he has limited time. Senator Patrick.
Thank you very much, Chair. Firstly, you might have heard me asking Austrac or mentioning with other witnesses. I note there was no submission from the Tax Office, which appears to be, or to me, it's quite surprising, and gives me the impression that you are not particularly interested in this bill.
Senator Patrick, thank you. It's not obvious to us from the bill, the Australian Taxation Office, that we, for example, would be the administrator of legislation that might flow from this bill when it's passed. And we're certainly not the regulator of the financial sector in Australia. We're not a criminal law enforcement agency, and they seem to be two strong elements that come through from aspects of the bill. So in that aspect, we didn't feel we really had an authority to talk about administration of something which we weren't clearly going to be, or perhaps obviously be the administrator. It's not going really to our strengths, and left space for the agencies we thought might be more relevant to those aspects of the bill. So that's why we didn't present a submission for the committee.
But in some respects, and you know, we're trying to deal with the black economy, which inherently, I presume, means collection of greater taxes for consolidated revenue. Or is the purpose of the bill, in your view, to, as was suggested by the Uniting Church, to basically make life more difficult for people who are attempting to money launder or so forth, or is the purpose to gain additional revenue?
Well, I defer to my Treasury colleagues about the purpose for the bill, Senator.
Well, the purpose of the bill is both. Given the high level, we would expect that, the majority of transactions, as the RBA said, is below 10,000. So we are really targeting the more egregious sort of tax evasion strategies here. In relation to who is responsible for the bill, Treasury is responsible for the policy, and we'll also be doing the guidance, so that is different to other tax measures. So once a tax measure is generally passed, responsibility for implementation will move on to the ATO, that is both enforcement and guidance. In this case, guidance will be done by us. Enforcement is probably going to be an amalgam. There is no one agency responsible for this. In relation to taking things to court, it's going to be the AFP and the CDPP. It is a criminal offence, so the AFP will have responsibility. If they investigate something and find a use of cash, they can then investigate that and prosecute. If the ATO find in some of their audits that there's a high chance that someone was using cash above 10,000, they could then pass that information either on to the AFP or to the CDPP if they believe there's enough evidence for prosecution. And that would be the same for something like the Fair Work Ombudsman and ASIC as well. So it's deliberately open, and that is because the black economy, as I said at the start, is a whole of government issue. It's not just a tax issue. So it can show itself up in numerous ways.
Okay, but I have to consider this legislation on its merits, and that involves trying to understand the benefit that flows from this, because I've certainly got people talking to me about the cost, not necessarily a financial cost, but constituents making complaints about the intention. And this, in some sense, goes to where Senator Brockman was exploring the $10,000 number. I would expect there would be perhaps some analysis, or perhaps qualified by uncertainties, as to if you put the number at 10,000, this is the sort of revenue we expect to generate, or this is the amount of money laundering we expect to inhibit in some way, versus if you drop it down to 2,000, this is what we then expect. I mean, it might be the case that most people who are conducting illegal activities handing over wads of cash in the $2,000 to $5,000 range, and in that instance, this bill would do very little. That's the bit I'm trying to unpack, and no one to date has provided an answer as to where that benefit lies in return in respect of consolidated revenue, and in relation to the point you've picked at $10,000.
Well, it's very hard to actually get data on this, mainly because, as I said before, it's hidden. So the task force...
Would it be fair to say that if this were enacted, you would then also be in a position where you wouldn't be able to even measure the effect of it?
I think that would be difficult to do, because we don't have a benchmark. What we do have, though, is evidence given to the task force in relation to businesses who know that they are being outbid by other businesses who are offering cash discounts. We do know that crime gangs deal in cash and try to use legitimate economy to wash that cash by buying high-value goods. So that is the evidence which the task force heard, and that is the evidence which was used to make a decision to set this threshold, one, to have a cash payment limit, but also then to set what the appropriate level would be.
So because I'm across a number of different portfolios, and I don't have the time to read that quite extensive report, I wonder if you could pull out on notice the relevant data that shows that would go to the benefit, even if it's only loosely quantifiable, perhaps from those reports and any other information that you have, that says this is why we should support this legislation in the face of a significant number of constituents who are against it.
Yeah, we can pull out the relevant extracts from the report and pass it on to the committee. Okay.
Now, the final question I have, Chair, and it also relates to one of the questions you asked. The exemptions, is that a disallowable instrument by which the minister?
Yes, it's certainly a disallowable instrument.
Okay. Now, I always have difficulty with legislation that's put up that doesn't provide the full picture, and I wonder why there wouldn't be any draft instrument that laid out what you were thinking at this point in time in relation to exemptions.
There are two versions of, we've issued two exposure drafts on the supporting rules. which are available up on the Treasury website, and we're happy to provide copies to the committee.
Yeah, once again, had we had a submission, it would have been, a lot of these questions could have been answered. All right, thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Senator Gallagher.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to go to this business of competition. So you are saying that there have been submissions to the task force from employers saying that people using cash were undercutting them. I mean, do we know how many submissions? Do we know the level of that, or is it?
So the task force did community halls, community meetings, and that's where a majority of this came from.
So there's no sort of statistical data. It's anecdotal, is it?
It is anecdotal, and I think if you ask most people if they've been offered a lower price for cash, they potentially will say yes. I've been speaking to people in relation to this matter. Some accountants who have said yes, they are aware of their clients complaining about that they find it harder to compete, and they know the reason for that. They're paying exactly the same input prices, they have to pay exactly the same wages, but they're being undercut by around 10%. And the reason for that is because the person doesn't want to pay their tax bill.
Okay. But I mean, you also make submissions to this committee on other legislation where you're proposing an amnesty and forgiving people for not paying their super. Is that not also anti-competitive? I mean, you can't have a competition argument both ways. If you're prepared to have an amnesty for people who haven't paid their super for 26 years and who won't up and want to pay a little bit now, is that not anti-competitive? I think there's a difference between amnesties and competition. And the whole idea of amnesties is getting people back into that system. I'm not sure about the SG, the super guarantee amnesty, but I imagine the purpose of that is to actually get the money into the employee's hands. Yeah. But there's no record keeping, so it's not likely to happen. That's the reality of that legislation. And that's before this committee and before the parliament. So when you tell me you do a couple of town halls and people complain about cash payments, I can understand that. But I don't think that's empirical evidence.
I think it is, because
Well,
it's advice from one
How many
business
people
what they've
told you
seen
that?
in an environment which they're
How many
competing
people
in.
told you? 10?
Well, it's a task force. I can't tell. It's a
12?
task force before my
So
time.
we're looking for some data.
Well, I think that it is quite common knowledge that people get offered cash discounts, in particular in certain industries, for work which is being done. And they get offered much lower cash than they do for electronic transactions.
And this is the solution to fix that, is it?
Well, that's one of the purposes, yes. We're trying to stop people from offering cash, paying cash above $10,000.
So the Reserve Bank's evidence was about 25% of cash in circulation goes in and out on transactions. About 4% is in the black economy. You agree with that?
Or 4 to 8%, they said.
Well, make it 8%. That still leaves a whole lot of money which people have chosen to collect.
Yes.
And this legislation now is placing imposition on how their legitimately collected money can be spent. Is that fair?
It's putting an obligation on businesses and them in relation to what they can spend that money on. Yes.
Okay, so you can't go out and buy a jet ski for $15,000 after this comes on with the money you got under your bed?
No, you can't.
Okay. And
But they
why
can
would you
still
be
get that
seeking
jet
to
ski.
stop that?
Because,
That's a
sorry?
legitimate use of your money.
But I suppose the issue is whether that's legitimate or illegitimate money. So that is hard to distinguish. And so you actually, if you want to stop criminals laundering money, you need to be able to put a limit on it. So it's impossible for the jet ski proprietor to say, yes, you look suspect, I'm not going to accept your money, as opposed to, oh, you look okay, I will accept your money.
Well,
So if you want to have something which is changing or targeting money laundering, this is the sort of provision which you do need to do that.
well, I mean, not everybody's sold on that idea because, suggesting that people who've stored cash rather than having it in a bank are illegal or in the black market or in a criminal enterprise would clearly be a very, very long bow given the statistics provided by the Reserve Bank. And if you listen to the funeral industry, there are a number of ethnic groups who like to pay for their funerals in cash. And that would currently, or in the future, be illegal if they managed to take $200 a week out of their pension for 5 years, with a simple view that they wanted to pay their funeral before they go. And if they go to the funeral director with cash, that's illegal. Why are you trying to stop that?
Well, the issue is we're trying to stop money laundering, and you have to
Fully
actually
support
have
that.
it across. You have to have it across the economy. You have to have it across all transactions for that to be effective.
Okay.
If you don't, then it's not effective. Then basically you won't have a system which can actually target money laundering in an effective way.
Okay. So if the economy is, black economy is between 4 and 6 or 8%, how does that stack up? How do you actually measure that? How do you work it out that it's between 4 and 8%, or you just
Oh,
rely
that's an RBA number. That's 48% of how much
Well,
cash
what,
is used.
you've got a head of economy, head of a black economy. I'd like to see a business card, I reckon that go down well. Division head, black economy division. Does that mean?
Yeah, that's me.
So what is the size of it then if you're head of that division?
Well, it's actually been defined in the report at 3% of the economy.
3%.
So at the time there was about 50 billion. The economy would have grown since then, so it's a bit higher if it's still at 3%. That is the estimate of the task force. I have seen estimates as high as 13%. I've seen estimates at 9%. The issue with this is that they are hidden transactions. The reason you're in the black economy is that you don't want to get caught. You're doing things to either avoid taxes, you're doing things for criminal activities. They aren't things which people generally put on surveys that, yes, I'm involved in this or this or this. So it's hard for the ABS to track that. There are different ways in which you try and make a determination of how large the cash economy is or the black economy. But they are estimates.
I understand, but I mean, you're already doing this work anyway. I'm just curious as to why this is suddenly a panacea for work you've been doing forever. So if you look at the transport industry, you know, it's alleged that people will turn up at a truck auction, pay $100,000 for the truck cash. All of a sudden, they've got legitimate business expenses now. They pay fuel, they pay tyres, they pay repairs, and they're in a business that's turning over money, and it looks like real money, goes through a bank account. Who knows where the cash is coming to generate the startup? Do you track that sort of activity?
Well, we can't. Well, no, at the moment, unless it's covered by the AUSTRAC system.
So there's a suggestion, not a suggestion, it's supposedly everybody in Sydney knows that, you know, the timber industry's, you know, a vehicle for people laundering cash, and the big government contracts like Badgerys Creek and the rest of it, they would be feeding those excavation and earth moving companies. Do you look at them?
Well, Treasury doesn't. I'm not saying another enforcement agency may not.
So, I mean, there's a groundswell of people who made submissions to this committee, which may be well out of your purvey because they're not in the black economy, they're just people who may occasionally choose to pay cash.
Yeah,
they're not criminals.
The evidence from the RBA is it's very, very low, the amount of transactions above 10,000 which aren't done in cash, based on their survey.
But you wouldn't know because no one's going to write and tell you if they paid cash, are they?
Well, they don't, no. But we know it happens.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't say that the fact that they don't do that means it doesn't happen. I'm pretty sure it does happen. If you look at law enforcement, Europol has basically said, yes, cash is the main source of transactions for criminal gangs.
Yeah.
I think most criminal enforcement agencies would say that cash is also the way which most criminal gangs do their transactions.
So how will it change?
Sorry, could I just interrupt there for a sec? Do we, from flowing on from the work done putting together this report, obviously there are prosecutions on people who are doing things illegally, who are laundering money.
Yes.
So do we have any backwards looking information that would reveal for the committee the kind of transactions that would be prevented under this legislation? So can we point to actual examples? Do you understand what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I think we would need to speak to the AFP.
Who would?
mention that.
Yeah, okay. Who would the committee speak to? The AFP.
It would probably be the AFP. Maybe. Well, I'm not sure if you asked that question of AUSTRAC.
Well, we didn't.
Because that information would basically come from AUSTRAC. AUSTRAC does not enforce, so they don't go off and actually do criminal prosecutions. That's my understanding. So they would pass that on to another organisation to do that on their behalf, and it's more likely to be the AFP.
Okay, because I think the committee would like to get a sense of, I guess we've got an issue where people are concerned about being able to carry out legitimate transactions above $10,000 in cash versus the prevention of money laundering and illegal tax evasion, that's a tautology, tax evasion, which obviously, the committee is absolutely on board with preventing. So it would be good to get a sense of that issue in the real world.
So your mention of the 3%, is there any, your first evidence there was that there was a 3% black economy? Is that underpinned by statistics or?
It's an estimate from the task force. We can get the extract on how that was calculated.
Okay, excellent. So tell me, why will this legislation suddenly stop people who are out there doing the wrong thing and suddenly, are you saying it's simply they won't be able to spend their cash?
That's right.
But what if they just spend $6,000 at a time? What if they, would they
It's
look
all
for-
about disruption. So at the moment, they want high value goods because one, it's less transactions for them.
Yeah.
And also there's a higher chance for them to be able to sell it. If I'm buying something $6,000 and let's say I have to move $2 million, you're looking at multiple transactions at $2 million. Once again, harder for them to do it. They'll need to get more people out there buying $6,000 goods, but they might be stuck with these goods, which they don't need.
Yep.
So they tend to use things which they can then on-sell.
Uh-huh.
So effectively,
So that's the 1.5 million,
that's
15.
1.5 million cars. So basically, they got that, they probably sold them.
How do you become aware of that now?
That was passed on to Michael Andrew from the car dealership.
But you wouldn't be aware of that, is that what you're saying?
Well, no.
So when that business does its report, it just logs...
So it doesn't do an AML report.
Oh,
So it may
well,
not have done an AML report in relation to that transaction.
But if they'd deposited that money into a bank, that would have been reported.
Yes, but then you don't know who the person is. So...
Well, you know who got it. You know who deposited it.
Well, the depositor would have been
Yeah.
the car dealer.
So can't you just go out and say, well, that was a rather large week for you. Did you do all right that week? I mean, isn't that what you do?
Well, it would have been deposited. The bank should have then passed that on to AUSTRAC. And then it's up to enforcement agencies to determine whether it's something which they would then proceed with. So for some person, it may not register for a few months. In that case, the thing is gone. The cars have been sold, no way of tracing them. And so the chances of an effective prosecution have probably reduced quite significantly. In relation to this, if there is something there, we would hope that the legitimate businesses will say, no, sorry, I can't do that, you have to do it electronically.
Right.
That is the way you disrupt the illegal behaviour. You have the honest business who will comply, saying, I cannot sell that goods to you because it's above $10,000. So effectively, that's the way you get a much greater enforcement and much greater effect of this legislation, because there's also a penalty in relation to that business selling.
Yeah, and I think that's where the inherent difficulty is in some respects from people who've made submissions saying, well, I haven't done anything wrong, why are you looking at me? Because you're actually using them to police the activity of others.
Yeah, it's pretty similar to like a bribery sort of provision. So bribery, you have a penalty on both offering and accepting a bribe. Not saying that these are briberies and that other businesses involved in bribes, but that it's effectively a similar principle. You actually need someone to say, no, I can't accept that bribe, to stop the bribe happening.
Okay. But in this circumstance, you're never going to get anybody to give themselves up because they're both going to get done, aren't they? No one's going to say, oh, I made a mistake.
But they won't have to give themselves up if they're complying with the law. So if they're complying with the law, basically the criminal gang who's trying to purchase the good above $10,000 won't be able to do it.
Are you certain that that's the way it's going to work?
Well, that's what we would hope.
Well, I mean, you're going to just...
We do know from the ATO that there's a high level of natural compliance with the tax law.
No, I'm sure that most
So
people...
most Australians will comply.
The ATO's reputation is such that you just pay your tax and move on.
But I think most people naturally comply with rules. And so that is a way of making this a much more effective outcome.
This will generate how much more data? So
Data?
there's no reporting at the moment?
Well, if every business above 10,000 every business trying to sell something above 10,000 doesn't accept it, it's no new data. Because basically, all it's like, it would be a legitimate transaction. So let's say I'm buying your jet ski for $15,000. I pay with a credit card as opposed to paying, I can't pay with cash, so I'll pay with credit card. So what you might find is, and what we already found from what the RBA said, they're not matching, they're not finding any contributions above, or transactions above 10,000 in cash anyway.
Right.
So if your benchmark mark is 0, we'd expect that to be 0.
So why have we got nearly 3,000 submissions to this fairly
I think there's some
innocuous
confusion, and probably legitimate confusion about what this is doing. We have had people call us, and a lot of the confusion is that they believe this is stopping them taking money out of the bank, that that the transaction is actually a withdrawal transaction, and that's not the case. You'll be able to put in much money in the bank and take out as much money in the bank and store as much money in a private area as you wish. All it does is target transactions. And once we've described that to people who phoned us, they've said, oh, okay, that's fine. There is that misunderstanding of what this provision will do.
Okay.
So even with, like we would expect, and let's say with your $15,000 example, that businesses will adjust. And we've already heard businesses which are preparing for people who want to pay cash, that they pay it directly into their bank account. So in that case, they've kept their ability to use cash. It's still meeting the law because basically it's a deposit into a bank account which is not covered by the law. They can still do that. It'll be up to the business and whether they wish to do that or not.
So instead of handing the cash to the business, you hand it to their bank?
Or an agent who will accept that money, which will put it into the bank
And
account.
that complies with this?
They'll comply with the law.
And that would be 0 transaction cost.
I'm not sure what, imagine it would be.
I don't even get charged for depositing
No,
money,
I
can you?
don't think so.
Probably working on it.
But that'd be up to the bank. That'd be up to the business, sorry, and whether they actually would allow them to do that.
Okay. So
That would get information then, because basically it's within the banking system. That's where we want that money to be in relation to higher value transactions.
So two individuals in the community swapping $20,000 is no issue?
If it's individual to individual,
Yeah.
that will be exempt.
Okay.
If it's individual to an entity which has a business purpose, that would be caught.
So the example that Senator Gallagher gave earlier, where he has an ABN that he hasn't used for a number of years, he would not be caught for a private transaction.
If it's private, no.
Unless there was a tax invoice
Yep.
being issued by one party.
Well, the way which you would think about that, if the senator purchased something and then started to claim deductions on that, that is
Yeah.
obviously for a business purpose.
Okay.
If you're using it for personal reasons, no, you won't be caught.
How about the issue that the Law Council, who was it?
Alliance, was it?
The Law Council raised, I think it was the Law Council, to do with effectively the person at the front end of the business who's actually taking the money, but who's an employee, potentially making them liable. Is that just a question of education for the business in
That's
your
a
view?
question
or-
for education for the business. So,
So is that the
both
flight?
parties-
Is
sorry?
that the flight centre example?
That, I think, is a flight centre example. Yeah.
So the person both paying and receiving are both liable for it. So it's a matter of education for businesses. And we're certainly pushing it on that because the business itself would also be liable, provided the employee is authorised to do so, and there's an obligation on businesses to change their internal procedures to prevent that happening. That said, it's not all that frequent that you would, turn up at Bunnings with $10,000 worth of cash and the person at the register would accept that or think something's not questionable when receiving it. So, but amounts of this magnitude are unusual.
So can I just use that example again? So if you go to the flight centre and you've saved up $3,000 and you hand it over, and then a month or two later you've got another $6 and you give it to them, and then you give them the final $2, gets you over the threshold. Is that captured by this or
So
not?
is this in respect to the same
Yeah, so it's the
supplies?
same
It's
holiday.
Same holiday?
Same holiday. Yeah.
So if it's the same holiday, you can make multiple payments up until you hit $10,000, and
Okay.
the rest of it has to be
But what-
electronic.
But if it's the individual who's taken the money who's liable, as well as the business, what if you went to 3 different people? Or you would potentially, would they have to remember that someone had been in and paid that account in cash before? I mean, is that what the flight tender's saying?
There's an expectation that businesses will need to alter their internal systems to track how they're receiving payments from individuals coming in, so that they can say, in those cases where it's, we're not talking about like a Coles scenario where you're buying different products.
Yeah, yeah.
It has to be the same product that you're paying off over time. Their systems will have to track the means by which those payments have been received. If the individual innocently takes the payment thinking that they haven't received multiple payments before, they're unaware of them, then they've got a defence of innocent mistake. So you wouldn't hold the individual liable in those particular cases because they've checked on the system. From what they can see on the records, they've not received any other payments in cash. They received that payment and puts them over. That's an innocent mistake, and the individual wouldn't be punished.
What about people who have ABN numbers for work? So, I mean, there are employers out there who ask people to come along with just their clothes on their back and an ABN number.
Yes.
What happens there? I mean, if they were to earn $10,000 in a month?
It all depends how they were paid. If they were paid fortnightly,
Sorry?
if they were paid fortnightly or whatnot. It's a business transaction. If they're working for someone, it's a business transaction.
So they couldn't get paid cash?
No.
They couldn't receive a payment of more than $10,000.
Yeah, more than cash, yeah.
They certainly could be paid over time, because if they're being paid over time in respect of work for like the previous week and it's less than $10,000, then they'll continue to get multiple cash payments. It's only if they're receiving one single lump sum payment that's in excess of $10,000, or the payment is in respect to the same supply.
So all of the subcontracting industry, where it might be a bricklayer or whatever, working for a larger company, present an invoice. You're saying there's no evidence that that's cash. You're saying that, well, using the Reserve Bank, they don't get paid cash. Is that what you're saying? So subcontractors, they put an invoice in after they've done 20,000 bricks, so the bill will be $20,000. Now, are you saying that all of that is electronic payments now?
No. I think what we're saying is that under this legislation, they'd only be able to pay it up to $10,000, and the rest would have to be done electronically. I think there probably may be situations where it is paid in cash.
And who's going to enforce all of this? I know you mentioned there's multi-jurisdictional, but in a perfect world you wouldn't need it because no one will do it.
Well, that would be the same for any law. I mean, if in the perfect world we wouldn't need police forces, because you potentially would say, okay, we're going to put in something on drink driving, no one will drink drive again. That's not the case. So you need some enforcement. I imagine that this will be found through investigations. So, for example, if the AFP is investigating a criminal gang, as part of that investigation, they may find that the criminal gang has made a payment above $10,000, and then that will be another penalty which they could then prosecute that gang or gang member for. In relation to transactions which are done by willing parties, they are always difficult to find. So, a money handed over in a private residence, it'd be difficult to find. I think in that case what we are relying on is if cash is offered to a homeowner and the homeowner is not prepared to do that, but they are prepared to then say this person has offered me a cash discount, they could call the ATO's Black Economy line. At that stage the person hasn't breached anything, but the person may be breaching other tax law. So there's a potential that they may get caught that way. So I imagine we could potentially get a lot of data, a lot of dob-ins from it. but they won't be prosecuted for a breach of the $10,000 limit. They might be found guilty of other offences.
Okay. So what about donations? That's always a topic of discussion.
Donations are court.
Donations to entities registered with the GST are court.
There's a question asked if you're not in church earlier, what if someone left you 20 grand in cash? Could you take it?
I think we've previously had the example where you don't necessarily, if there's like a church box. I mean, if someone actually physically goes to hand the church $10,000 or $20,000 in cash, the church can't accept that. But the church wouldn't know if someone put it in the box at the back. There's just a box full of amounts, so the church is unaware, of course, as to how that money got there, what the makeups were, in which case it just deposits it.
But
so it's in no
clearly
position
all political organisations would be caught up by this legislation.
They certainly would, yes.
So cash donations would be...
Well, cash donations of $10,000 or more.
Between two ABN numbers it'd be, what is it, 120?
Even a private individual to a political party, it couldn't be in excess of
A private
$10,000
individual to a
above,
political
yes.
party? Yeah.
Yes. And we
So that'd be 120 penalty points and 2 years jail, is it?
the maximum penalty.
It's a maximum penalty. There's also the strict liability provision, which is a lower amount of money as well, lower amount of penalty points.
So what's your tip? Who's the first one going to get prosecuted? The bikies or the politicians? I don't have to answer that.
I will say bikies.
Good answer. Good answer. I take it that was your last question.
Yeah. Go on.
All right. Thank you very much for your time today. That concludes today's hearing. On behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank all those who have made submissions and sent representatives here today for their cooperation in this inquiry. I thank the Secretariat, Hansard, Broadcasting, and on that note, the committee stands adjourned.